The sound of a door latching shut is not usually a dramatic thing. It is one of the quietest sounds a house makes, no louder than a pin dropping onto a wooden floor. But when Nora heard it close behind her on that late September morning, it carried the full weight of a slammed iron gate. She did not flinch. She had heard it coming for months in the flat arithmetic of her father's silences, in the way he calculated dinner portions, in the way he had stopped meeting her eyes sometime in the summer when the harvest came in short and the counting began. She was 16 years old. In her left hand she held a small leather pouch with $17 inside, her entire severance from the world she had known since birth. In her right hand she held a folded, brittle deed her father had pressed into her hand from her grandmother's sparse effects without once lifting his eyes from the far wall. A woman grown makes her own way, he had said. His voice was not cruel. It was flat and arithmetic, and that was somehow worse than cruelty, which at least would have meant she mattered enough to be angry at. One less mouth was a measurable gain in a difficult year. She did not look back at the house. She did not look at her younger brother Samuel's pale face watching her through the rippled glass of the window, his breath making small clouds against the cold glass. Looking back was a luxury she could not afford. She kept her eyes on the road, and she walked. The walk into Dusty Flats was a long, slow rehearsal of her inventory. $17. A deed. One Goodwill coat that had seen 2 hard winters before it reached her. 2 dresses. A tinder box. A small knife with a bone handle. The deed felt like a mockery from the moment she unfolded it. A piece of paper for a patch of stone and scrub that no one had found a use for in living memory, pressed into her hand the way you press a useless thing into someone else's hand when you want to be rid of both of them at once. Mr. Harlan confirmed this when she laid it on the counter of his mercantile, and he peered at it over his spectacles and set it back down with the gentle pity of a man delivering a verdict he considers obvious and final. The old Deadstone Hollow claim, he said, all rock and ravine. No water to speak of. The only thing it has ever sheltered is rattlesnakes. Rattlesnakes and the ambitions of people who don't know what they're looking at, he added, almost to himself. He told her $17 would buy a stagecoach ticket east with a few meals to spare. That was a sensible play. A girl her age in a bigger town could find work in a shop or a household, something safe and warm and inside. Nora looked at the dwindling coins in her palm. She thought about what a ticket east actually meant. It meant being a stranger in a bigger town with the same empty hands, and no land under her feet, and no claim to anything at all. At least the rock was hers. Nobody could take a deed from a girl who had already left. She bought an axe, a bow saw, a sack of flour, a block of salt, dried beans. She pushed every coin she had across the worn-wood counter, and walked out carrying a pack that would have slowed a grown man who was not paying attention to his footing. Mr. Harlan watched her go with the expression of a man watching someone walk calmly toward conclusion he has already written in his head. The walk to the Deadstone Hollow claim took the better part of 2 days, the land growing steadily more hostile as she moved away from the wagon-rutted roads and into the fractured stone and thorny scrub of the high frontier, the comfortable soil of the valley giving way to something harder and more honest the further she walked. The thorns tore at the hem of her dress. The pack ground down on her shoulders. The sun was cold and thin. A hawk circled high above her the entire second day, riding thermals in wide, lazy circles, watching her the way hawks watch things that might fall. It was the only living thing that seemed to know she existed. By evening she found it, a sheer cliff face of gray, weathered granite, rising from the earth, and at its base a dark yawning opening like a held breath. Her inheritance. She stood before it with the last of the day's light fading behind her, and a wave of despair washed over her so deep and complete it nearly buckled her knees. Mr. Harlan was right. It was a home for snakes and shadows, and nothing that any sensible person would choose. But the wind was rising fast across the ridge, and there was no other shelter visible in any direction, and she was 16 years old with nowhere else to go, and no coin left for anywhere else even if she could find it. She lit a piece of tinder from her box and stepped inside. The entrance tunnel was short and opened quickly into a large vaulted chamber, rock walls smooth and shaped by long-vanished water, the ground dry sand and gravel, the air completely still and sheltered from the gale building outside. She walked deeper into the dark with her small flickering flame, and then she heard it, a slow rhythmic drip. She followed the echo through the dark and found a fissure in the far wall, and from a single drop of clean water fell with a clear resonant sound into a shallow pool in the rock below. Clean, untainted, steady. She pressed her fingers flat against the wall beside the fissure. It radiated a faint, deep earth warmth. Thermal mass, the memory of summer stored in stone, quietly and stubbornly resisting the cold that was building outside. The town saw a useless hole in the ground. They saw darkness and rock and the smell of deep earth, and they called it nothing. They were wrong. This was not a grave. This was a fortress. A well. A root cellar. A buffer against the killing frost. All of it sealed inside one ancient piece of rock that had been waiting here since before anyone in Dusty Flats was born. The despair that had gripped her 60 seconds ago was replaced by something harder and quieter and far more useful. The grim, focused resolve of a person who has just seen what nobody else bothered to look for. She had found the secret the deed had been holding. Now she had to build everything else herself. From nothing. Alone. At 16 years old. In a place where nobody was coming to check on her. She set down her pack, straightened her back, and got to work. The first week was an education in the brutal honesty of labor that no amount of watching her father work had fully prepared her for. Every morning, Nora woke on the hard cave floor with her muscles screaming and her hands raw and blistered from the previous day. And every morning she rose before light came and went straight back to the work without allowing herself the luxury of sitting with the pain. Her plan was clear in her head, even if it was monumental in execution. The cave would be the protected, stable heart of her homestead, the food store, the animal shelter, the subterranean garden. The living space would be a small cabin built directly against a rock face, sealing the cave entrance and creating a 2-chambered shelter. The cabin would face the morning sun to capture whatever warmth the high country offered. The cave would be the dark, cool engine running behind it, invisible to the outside world and impervious to whatever weather descended on the ridge. She had never felt a tree before in her life. She found a small, hardy grove of pine a quarter-mile down the ravine, and she began, remembering the way her father had sized up a trunk before committing to it, the way he cut the notch on a fall's side to guide where it would land. Her first attempts were clumsy, the bow saw catching and sticking the green wood, her axe strokes glancing and inefficient and costing her twice the energy they needed to. But she was methodical in particular way of a person who has no one else to fall back on and no margin for the kind of mistakes that come from rushing. She learned the rhythm of the blade. She learned to use her body weight rather than her arm strength, to let the tool do what it was designed to do if she moved correctly with it. The first tree that groaned and shifted and finally cracked and crashed to the frozen earth was terrifying and deeply satisfying in equal measure. A sound she felt in her whole body, a declaration that the land could in fact be worked if you were willing to work it. Getting the logs to the building site required its own education entirely. She could not lift them, so she learned leverage. Smaller branches used as rollers beneath the logs. Pathways cleared through the brush to reduce friction. The natural slope of the ravine used as an ally rather than an obstacle. Every single log represented a full day of planning and hauling and resting and hauling again. By the end of the first week, she had a dozen stripped and lying near the mouth of the cave, and she looked at them in the early dark and felt the first true measure of pride she had felt since the door latched behind her. She built her foundation from flat, heavy stones gathered from the surrounding area, measuring the perimeter with her own paces. 12 steps long, 8 steps wide. Small, but hers. She lived on thin flour and water gruel cooked over a small fire just inside the cave entrance, and felt her strength beginning to thin from the meager fuel, her body burning through its reserves faster than the gruel could replace them. But the sight of the growing pile of logs and the neat rectangle of foundation stones was a different kind of nourishment that the gruel could not provide. It was proof that her decision was not folly. Proof that her labor could impose order on a hostile piece of rock that the entire town of Dusty Flats had dismissed as worthless. The walls rose with agonizing slowness. She rigged a simple A-frame derrick from a rope and a nearby stunted tree to hoist the heavy notched logs into place, a process where a single slip could destroy a week of work or send a log crashing down onto the person operating the rope below. Each timber that settled correctly into its notch was a victory measured in inches. When the 4 rough walls stood, she spent 2 full days chinking every gap with a mixture of sandy soil and dried grasses in the ravine, forcing the wet mud into every crack with numb fingers until the wind no longer came through and the cabin began to feel like a room that intended to stay. The fireplace came next. Flat stones stacked against a solid cliff face with mud mortar. A flue vented through a natural fissure in the rock overhead that she painstakingly widened with her knife. The first fire filled the cabin with smoke, and a familiar pang of despair returned. She found the blockage, cleared it, tried again. The smoke drew clean, and a steady radiant heat began filling the small space, and she sat before those flames and felt something she had not felt since September, warmth that belonged entirely to herself. Then she turned her attention to reinforcing the cave for its true purpose, and the night, it almost ended everything. She had been fitting timber beams against the natural rock formations in the deeper section of the cave to support a portion of ceiling that felt less solid than the rest when she tested it with her hands. She worked late into the night by lantern light on a Thursday in early November, the kind of work that requires full attention and patience and the willingness to keep going when the body wants to stop. She had just moved to the far end of the cave to check the water basin level when she heard it. Not a crack, but a deep concussive thud that she felt in her sternum before it reached her ears. She spun around. The central beam had shifted and given way. A section of the ceiling had come down directly onto her supply sacks and her spare tools, and the rubble had collapsed the connecting passage between the cave and the cabin into a solid wall of broken stone and timber and earth. The lantern had survived on its stone shelf to her left. She held it up toward the collapse with shaking hands. The passage was completely sealed. She was trapped in the deep section of the cave with the animals, one lantern with perhaps 6 hours of oil left in it, no voice that would carry through tons of rock, and nobody in Dusty Flats who knew she existed or was coming to find out. She sat down on the cave floor and allowed herself exactly 1 minute of pure undiluted terror. She counted it out. Then she stood up and started working. She rationed the lantern to 1 hour of light per day and worked in the darkness the rest of the time, her hands learning the shape of the rubble by feel, what shifted, what was stable, what could be moved, and in what order. She ate raw carrots pulled from her garden beds and drank from the stone basin drip and talked quietly and continuously to the sheep and the hens, not because she thought they understood, but because the sound of her own voice in the total dark was the only anchor keeping her mind from the edge that waited just beyond rational thought. On the second day, her last hour of lantern oil burned down to nothing, and she worked in complete and absolute darkness by touch alone, measuring progress in handfuls of rubble moved and inches of passage reopened. On the morning of the third day, her bleeding hands broke through into firelight of the cabin on the other side. She crawled through the gap she had made and collapsed onto the cabin floor and shook for 1 full unbroken hour. Then she got up. She sharpened her tools. She went back into cave and reinforced the ceiling properly this time, with the knowledge of someone who had already paid the full price of doing it wrong. The cave had tried to take her back. She had taken it back instead. This is Echoed True Stories. If this story is hitting you somewhere deep right now, subscribe and ring that bell, because what comes next is going to change everything. The dwindling sack of flour and the last handful of dried beans told her what the calendar already knew. She had to return to Dusty Flats before the winter sealed every road and made the journey impossible until spring. She needed livestock. Without animals in the cave, Penn's system she had built was incomplete. She needed laying hens for protein, sheep for wool and eventual meat, and she needed the final weight of salt that would make preservation possible through the long months ahead. She had been running the numbers in her head for 3 days, mapping every remaining resource against every remaining need, when she heard the sound at the cabin door late on a bitter Tuesday night, just at the edge of full dark. Not the frantic, weakening thudding of a person dying in a storm. A quiet knock, hesitant and small, as though the person on the other side of the door was not entirely certain they had the right to be standing there at all. She took the iron poker from beside the fireplace and opened the door. Samuel stood on the doorstep in the dark, wearing a coat 2 sizes too small that she recognized as the coat she had grown out of the year before her father gave it to him. His face was pinched deep red from the cold, and he was carrying nothing at all in his hands except the direction someone in Dusty Flats had pointed him when he described where his sister had gone. He had been walking for 2 full days. He had run away from their father 6 weeks after Nora left. The house without her had become a different kind of cold entirely, the specific kind that has nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the quality of the silence at the dinner table. He was 13 years old, and he was shaking from his boots to his collar, and he did not say anything at all when she opened the door. He just looked at her with her grandmother's eyes and their father's face, and waited to find out what she would do. Nora looked at her brother, standing on her doorstep. She looked past him at the dark, and the cold settling in hard across the ridge. She ran the calculation without pretending she wasn't running it. Her food stores rationed to the wire for 1 person. Firewood allocated to the exact cord she needed to reach the thaw. Every margin she had built into the system already thin from the cave collapse that had cost her 3 days of work and a portion of her supplies. Adding Samuel was a genuine mathematical risk, not a sentimental one. A real one that could push her stores past the point of recovery before the spring came. She held all of that clearly in her mind. Then she stepped aside from the doorway. Because she had already learned in the dark of the collapsed cave something the town of Dusty Flats had not yet been forced to understand. Survival is not a prize you win and then guard. It is a state you maintain by choosing, every single time you have a choice, to share the warmth you have managed to build. She fed him from the pot and let him sleep beside the fire, and in the morning she showed him everything. The cave, the reinforced ceiling, the garden beds with their pale, stubborn growth, the water basin and the steady drip, the pen she had built from woven saplings. Samuel moved through it all without speaking, his dark eyes moving from system to system with an expression that Nora recognized because she had felt herself standing in the vaulted chamber for the first time. The specific shock of a place being more than you were told it was. He asked no questions. He simply started working. He was smaller than Nora, and his hands were not yet calloused, but he had their father's methodical nature, without their father's coldness, and she found within the first week that 2 people changed the mathematics of the operation in ways she had not fully anticipated. Water hauling that took her an hour took them 30 minutes. The firewood stack that had been shrinking faster than she liked began to hold its ground. The animal pens were cleaned and the garden beds were tended, and the cave ceiling was checked and the fire was managed, and the whole system ran more smoothly than it had since she built it. In the evenings, when the fire burned low and the animals were settled and the day's labor was finished, Samuel sometimes asked about their father, not with anger or grief exactly, more the quiet way a person presses on a bruise to confirm it is still there. Nora answered honestly. She did not know if their father understood yet what he had thrown away when he sent her out the door with a useless deed and $17 and the cold arithmetic of 1 less mouth. She suspected that understanding would come from the way most hard understanding came, slowly and in the form of something missing rather than something present. What she knew was that the 2 of them were here, in a place that had been called a grave and was in fact a home, building something real that could not be undone by a difficult year or a man who confused 1 less mouth with 1 less person. She did not say all of this to Samuel. She said enough of it. He listened in the particular quiet way of a 13-year-old who was filing things away for later. Then they banked the fire and went to sleep, and in the morning they got back to work. The following morning she made the journey to Dusty Flats with Samuel walking beside her, her body harder and leaner than the last time she had come down this road, her hands the hands of a person who has been tested by something real. The bell over Harlan's door announced them both. Mr. Harlan looked up and his eyebrows rose with genuine surprise at the sight of her, then surprise again at the boy beside her. Wade the trapper was in his corner. The commentary came as predictably as weather. The winter would be her tomb. The livestock would freeze before New Year. She was throwing good coin after bad. Nora placed what remained on the counter. For laying hens, a ewe and a ram, 50 pounds of salt. She did not answer the commentary, because the only answer she had ever had was not a word. It was a result. The town watched her lead the small flock out of Dusty Flats, with Samuel walking quietly beside her, and the whispers followed them down the road. Poor things, lost their minds to grief. The judgment sat on her shoulders like a familiar weight. It was lighter than the last time. She had already survived things the people whispering behind their hands had never had to imagine. The warning came not as wind but as silence. The world outside went unnaturally still in a way that Nora had learned to read in the weeks since she had become a person who paid close attention to the language of weather and stone and pressure in the air. The birds that had been picking at the frozen ground near the cabin stopped and disappeared all at once, as if a signal had been given that only they could hear. The atmosphere grew thick and heavy, pressing down on a ridge in a way that was physical and unmistakable. When the first flakes finally came, they were not the gentle drifting kind that made the world look like a picture. They were small, hard pellets driven nearly horizontal by a wind that rose from an eerie whisper to a full, sustained roar in the space of 1 hour. Nora secured the heavy plank door and braced it with a thick log she kept for that purpose. Samuel was already on the porch moving the remaining firewood inside without being told. His face turned away from the driving ice, stacking the wood in the corner with the focused efficiency of a boy who had been paying close attention for weeks. Within 2 hours, the window was buried completely, and the cabin was sealed inside a dim amber firelight. The mounting snow pressing against the outer walls, adding a second layer of insulation that pushed the warmth back on itself in a way that even Nora had not fully anticipated when she was building. The roar of the storm was muffled to a low, sustained pressure, felt more than heard. She moved into the cave, and the transition was always a shock. The air instantly cooler, smelling of damp earth and animal warmth and the faint, clean scent of stone. The sheep were calm in their pen. The hens slept with their heads tucked under their wings. The pale winter lettuce and the thin carrots grew in their dark beds with the specific indifference of living things that do not know a storm is happening because no storm has ever reached them. The water dripped into the basin with its patient metronomic sound. Nora placed her hand flat against the solid rock wall. Cool, unmoving, eternal. It had stood through 1,000 such storms before she was born, and it would stand through 1,000 more after she was gone. She was not fighting the blizzard. She was simply outside its reach, sheltered inside something older and more durable than weather. The town had called this place her tomb. Standing in the deep quiet of the cave with Samuel beside her, while the worst storm anyone in Dusty Flats could remember tried to take apart the world outside, she thought about that word and let it sit in her mind for a moment before setting it down. She looked at the lamb sleeping against its mother in the pen. She looked at the green things growing in the dark. She looked at her brother's face lit by the lantern, steady and calm and belonging here as naturally as if he had always been here. She said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. She thought about the ceiling. She thought about the 2 days of working the dark by feel alone, rationing the candle hour, talking to the sheep to keep her own voice from going silent in the black. She thought about the specific quality of that darkness, not the darkness of a night with stars behind it, but the total darkness of a sealed space deep in the earth where no light had ever existed naturally. She had been 16 years old and entirely alone, and the passage out had been a wall of rock and timber, and she had moved it handful by handful. She thought about what that had taught her, not about caves or ceilings or the structural properties of timber, about herself, about what was actually in her when everything else was stripped away, and there was nothing left but the work and the dark and the question of whether she was going to keep going. She had kept going. She kept going now. Then she heard it cutting through the sustained roar of the storm, a rhythmic muffled thudding against the heavy plank door, the desperate irregular beat of a human fist weakening with each strike. She froze with the ladle hovering over the stew pot. No animal made that sound. Her first instinct was cold fear. The world was supposed to be dead out there, the storm too violent for anything to be moving through it. She moved silently to the fireplace and closed her hand around the iron poker and looked at Samuel. "Stay here," she said. She lifted the log brace and pulled the door inward just enough to see. A figure more snow and ice than person fell through the gap and collapsed onto the floor at her feet. She dragged him toward the fire. As the snow melted from his face, she recognized him. Wade, the trapper from Harlan's store. The man who had told her with complete casual confidence that this cave would be her tomb before the new year. He was barely conscious, his words coming in broken frozen fragments between shallow rattling breaths. Wagon overturned. Harlan and his wife. Out there. Still out there. She felt the cold knot tighten in her chest with the specific quality of a problem that has no good solution, only choices. not one life away. 3. Her stores were rationed for 2 people now through the rest of the winter, with no significant margin remaining after the cave collapse had cost her a week of supplies. Adding 3 more mouths through a blizzard of unknown duration was a genuine threat to everything she had built. She was aware of all of it in the moment. She looked at Wade shivering toward death on her floor, and then looked at Samuel across the room, meeting her eyes. She saw him understand the calculation. She saw him accept the answer she had already reached. She bundled herself in every layer she owned. She wrapped her face in wool, until only her eyes showed. She took the lantern and the rope and the rest of the hot stew sealed in a pot, and she walked back out into the roaring white darkness, because she had already decided, in the cave with the collapsed ceiling and the dying lantern, that survival was not something you protected by withholding it. You protected it by sharing it whenever you had any to share. She kept the cliff face to her left as her only landmark in the blinding whiteness, and forced herself through waist-deep snow one brutal burning step at a time. When the dark shape of the overturned wagon finally emerged from the white, she found them huddled in its lee. Mr. Harlan and his wife, their faces masks of disbelief and shock as her lantern light fell upon them. She did not wait for her explanations. She got them to their feet. She brought them home. Echoed true stories. Do not go anywhere. Subscribe right now and ring that bell, because Chapter 5 is the one this whole story has been building toward, and you need to hear it. Getting Mrs. Harlan back through the storm was the hardest physical thing Nora had done since she dragged herself out of the collapsed cave with bleeding hands in total darkness. The woman could barely lift her feet, her strength nearly exhausted, and Nora half-carried and half-dragged her the entire distance back through waist-deep drifts with her own muscles burning past the point where pain had any meaning, and into something quieter and more absolute. The pure mechanical determination of a person who has already decided that stopping is not one of the available options. When they finally stumbled to the cabin door, the sudden warmth hit them all like a physical force, a wall of heat and light, and the smell of simmering stew that was the most welcoming thing any of them had felt in hours. Mr. Harlan stood dripping in the firelight and stared. He took in the crackling fire, the neat, precise stack of firewood along the wall. Wade stirring by the hearth, wrapped in a dry blanket. Samuel already moving quietly and efficiently to ladle hot water into a basin from Mrs. Harlan's hands, anticipating what was needed without being asked. The specific competence of a boy who had been paying close attention and learning fast. Then Nora lit the second lantern and led them through the passage into the cave, and Mr. Harlan's composure simply shattered. He stood in the entrance of the deep chamber, and his eyes moved slowly from one thing to the next with the expression of a man who was being forced to rebuild his understanding of something he thought he understood completely. The placid sheep in their woven sapling pen, the hens settling back into their roosts after the disturbance, clucking softly. The impossible rows of pale winter lettuce and thin pale carrots growing in raised beds of hauled dark soil in the deep mountain dark. Living green things in the dead of winter, underground, thriving in a place where nothing should have been able to thrive. The steady metronomic drip of clean water into the stone basin, faithful and unhurried. The reinforced ceiling beams above, fitted with the careful, deliberate precision of a person who had learned their lesson about ceilings at the most brutal possible cost. The organized, intentional genius of it all. The two-chambered system. The thermal mass of the ancient rock working as insulation, the way every element served every other element in a design that a 16-year-old girl had conceived and built from $17, an axe, and a refusal to accept that a useless piece of rock had to stay useless. He turned to face Nora, and his face was not one thing, but several arriving simultaneously. Awe and shame and gratitude, and the specific grief of man confronting in full how completely and casually wrong he had been about another person, how easily and confidently he had written off what he had not bothered to truly look at. "We called you a fool," he said, and his voice broke on the last word with a roughness that had nothing to do with the cold. "My God, we were the fools." Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she went to the fire and ladled stew into bowls and handed them around without ceremony. "There's food," she said. Her voice carried nothing in it. No triumph, no bitterness, no need to have her intelligence acknowledged by the people who had questioned it. Only the quiet, settled certainty of a person who stopped requiring acknowledgement somewhere around the third week of chinking gaps in a wall in the dark with no audience, and no encouragement, and no one coming. She looked across the fire at Samuel, and he gave her the smallest possible nod that contained everything. "Eat," she said. The blizzard raged for 3 more days. Inside the cabin and the cave, a strange, quiet truce settled over all 5 of them. Harlan and his wife and Wade watched Nora and Samuel move through their days, tending the animals, checking the garden beds, managing the fire, hauling water from the basin, the rhythm of their survival unbroken and unpretentious, never faltering and never performing. They saw that what had been built here was not luck and not stubbornness. It was months of intelligent, methodical, relentless work by a 16-year-old girl the entire town had dismissed before she had even begun, and a 13-year-old boy who had walked 2 days to the cold to stand beside her. When the storm finally broke and the world outside emerged silent and dazzlingly white under a cleared sky, the 3 guests prepared to leave. There were no speeches, only a quiet, profound shift in the way each of them held themselves. The specific change that comes over people who have witnessed something real and can no longer pretend they did not see it clearly. Mr. Harlan pressed a gold coin into Nora's hand. "This is not charity," he said, looking directly at her. "It is payment for passage. A transaction between equals." She accepted it with a nod. It was a right framing, not a reward for being pitted, but an acknowledgement of the competence that had kept 3 extra lives alive through a 3-day blizzard from stores rationed for 2. Then something made her turn the coin over in her palm. On the reverse face was a small scratch mark, a diagonal line crossed with a short horizontal stroke near the top, the mark her grandmother had always made on her coins, so she could find them in a crowded purse when the coins of several households were mixed together. Nora had seen that mark 100 times as a child, sitting at the kitchen table beside her grandmother while the old woman sorted her small, careful savings with patient, steady hands and explained to Nora why it mattered to mark the things that belonged to you. This coin had passed through those hands. It had traveled to the commerce of Dusty Flats, through the mercantile till, through the years between her grandmother's life and hers, and had found its way back. The brittle deed, the useless rock, the $17 that had bought an axe and a bow saw and a sack of flour, the goodwill coat. Her grandmother had been slowly diminished in her last years, worn down by the steady pressure of a town that measured things only by their surface value, and found her wanting by that measurement. She had left Nora the one thing she had that nobody had managed to take away, a deed to a piece of rock that everyone agreed was worthless, that no one had looked at closely enough to see what it actually contained. She had known, not in words, in a particular way that women who have survived difficult things sometimes know, quietly, without announcement, passing the knowledge forward in the only form they have left to pass it in. Nora closed her fingers around the coin. She said nothing to anyone about the scratch mark, but when she set her other earnings on the shelf that evening, she kept the coin separate, placing it in a small tin on the stone ledge above the water basin, in the deep quiet of the cave, where the drip was the only sound. It was not money. It was a message from the woman who had seen something in a useless piece of rock that an entire town had walked past without noticing. It was proof that the women in this family had always known how to find a thing worth keeping inside what everyone else had thrown away. The story Harlan and Wade and Mrs. Harlan carried back to Dusty Flats spread to the snowbound town like fire through dry timber in the late winter thaw. The tale of the foolish girl in the cave was finished and buried. In its place grew the legend of the woman at Deadstone Hollow, the one whose foresight had saved 3 lives when everyone else's preparations had failed, the one whose useless inherited land had proven to be the most secure homestead in the county when the worst blizzard in living memory came down and tested every other one. As the deep snows receded, a new kind of visitor began making the long trek to her door. They came not to pity but to trade. A neighbor brought seed potatoes. The blacksmith offered to forge her proper door hinges. People brought nails and salted pork and jars of preserves. They did not offer charity. They offered barter, the transaction of equals, the recognition that her judgment about survival had proven sounder than all of theirs combined. She was 16 years old, and she had become something the town of Dusty Flats had not expected and could not now take back, a vital and respected member of the frontier community whose opinion on the nature of hard things was worth seeking out. She was 16 years old. She had arrived at Deadstone Hollow with $17 and a deed to a useless piece of rock, and the refusal to accept that useless and worthless were the same thing. She had built a fortress out of a grave. She had fed 3 people through the worst storm in living memory from a garden that had no right to exist. She had dug herself out of a collapsed cave in total darkness with bare bleeding hands because no one was coming and she was not finished yet. And standing in the spring sunlight with Samuel beside her, and the first green shoots pushing through the enriched earth at her feet, and the young lamb in the pen, and the coin on its shelf in the dark behind her, she looked at the vast sheer face of the rock, and she did not see an ending. She saw the beginning of the next phase. The work was not over. The work would never be over. And in that simple, enduring fact, she had found something the town of Dusty Flats could not have given her even if it had chosen to, a peace that belonged entirely to herself. If this story moved the way it moved us, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Echo True Stories so you never miss a story about the kind of strength that builds quietly and lasts forever. Share this today with someone who needs to hear it.